starting in verse 8. Do not be in dread, you people, and do not become stupefied. This is God talking. Have I not from that time on caused you individually to hear and told it out? And you are my witnesses. Does there exist a God besides me? No, there is no rock. I've recognized none. And of course, as we know, Psalm 82:6 explicitly has God recognizing other gods whom he judges. Gods who are elsewhere identified by Jesus in John 10:33 through 36 as the sons of God. They're also identified as sons of the Most High in Psalm 82, and as angelic gods who are appointed over the nations. In the entire context of the book of Psalms, I did a whole video about it, and I've talked about it in several videos, consistent with Deuteronomy 32:8 and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The sons of God were appointed as gods over the nations. So what's he talking about here? If God says, I said you are gods, Psalm 82:6, and Jesus affirms that in John 10:33 through 36, why does God say here, does there exist a God besides me? No, there is no rock. For the same reason he says, there was no one with me, or I did it all by myself in verse 24. Keep reading. Verse 9. The formers of the carved image are all of them an unreality. He's not talking about the spirit sons of God, who, as we're going to see in a moment, were with God when he created all things. He's talking about idols formed by his own people or the nations, which are not gods. The rest of verse 9, and their darlings themselves will be of no benefit, and as their witnesses they see nothing and know nothing, in order that they may be ashamed. Verse 10, who has formed a god, or cast a mere molten image? Of no benefit at all it has been. Verse 11, look, all his partners themselves will be ashamed, and the craftsmen are from earthling men. They will all of them collect themselves together. They will stand still. They will be in dread. They will be ashamed at the same time. Verse 12, as for the carver of iron with the billhook, he has been busy at it with the coals, and with the hammers he proceeds to form it. Form what? A god. Verse 10, who has formed a god? And he keeps busy at it with his powerful arm. Also, he has become hungry, and so without power. He has not drunk water, so he gets tired. Verse 13, as for the wood carver, he has stretched out the measuring line. He traces it out with red chalk. He works it up with a wood scraper, and with a compass he keeps tracing it out. And gradually he makes it like the representation of a man. He's talking about idols. The whole thing is about idols. Idol gods, which are not gods, like God, and the sons of God, whom God himself said are gods. Psalm 82:6. His own son reaffirms this. John 10:33 through 36. Context. You have to use the context, or you'll come up with anything like Trinitarianism, which is nowhere in this context. We're talking explicitly, continuously, right after verse 8, all the way down from verses 9 through 13 at this point, about idols and how the iron worker and the wood carver are creating idols, but which are not gods. Verse 13, the rest of it, like the beauty of mankind to sit in a house, there is one whose business is to cut down cedars, and he takes a certain species of tree, even a massive tree, and he lets it become strong for himself among the trees of the forest. He planted the laurel tree, and the pouring rain itself keeps making it get big. Verse 15, and it has become something for man to keep a fire burning. So he takes part of it that he may warm himself. In fact, he builds a fire and actually bakes bread. The very thing that people use to carve idols, wood, is used to make a fire, to bake bread. He's belittling the idols. He's making them of no account. in comparison to himself, because his people and the people of the nations are having this problem with idols. And it says in verse 15 again, so he takes part of it that he may warm himself. He builds a fire, bakes bread. He also works on a god to which he may bow down. He has made it into a carved image and he prostrates himself to it. What's he talking about here, everyone? It's like explicit in every single verse, from verse 48 where he says, besides me there is no God, and we're approaching verse 24 where he alone did these things, who was with me. The whole context is about idols who are not gods, whom the people continued to bow down to as gods. None of them were with him. None of them are gods. Verse 16, half of it he actually burns up in a fire. Upon half of it he roasts well the flesh that he eats, and he becomes satisfied. He also warms himself and says, aha, I've warmed myself and I've seen the firelight. But the remainder of it he actually makes into a god itself, into his carved image. He prostrates himself to it and bows down and prays to it and says, deliver me, for you are my God. Verse 18, they have not come to know, nor do they understand, because their eyes have been besmeared so as not to see, their heart so as not to have insight. Verse 19, and no one recalls to his heart or has knowledge or understanding, saying, the half of it I have burned up in a fire, and upon its coals I have also baked bread. I roast flesh and eat, but the rest of it I shall make into a mere detestable thing, a god, an image to bow down to and say, you are my God. To the dried out wood of a tree I shall prostrate myself. It's the same thing. Over and over and over again, we are reminded of what we're talking about here. And yet Trinitarians repeatedly bring up not only verse 24, where they get confused over the Son's role and God's role in creation in reference to idols, but also verse 8, where it says there is no God besides me. Even though God said there are other gods who are the sons of God, when he's not talking about idols as gods, and when he's talking about idols as gods, he's not excluding the sons of God whom he calls gods, gods. Verse 20, he is feeding on ashes. His own heart that has been trifled with has led him astray, and he does not deliver his soul, nor does he say, is there not a falsehood in my right hand? Remember these things, O Jacob, and you Israel, because you are my servant. I have formed you. You are a servant belonging to me. O Israel, you will not be forgotten on my part. See, he's not even really talking about the idols or gods the sons of God appoint over the nations. He's talking to Israel. And while this may apply also to the idol gods of the nations, which aren't gods, the sons of God behind those idols are gods. God said they're gods. He's really addressing Israel here, isn't he? And he's the only God to Israel, working through the appointed prince of Israel, Michael, whom also is a God, just like the other sons of God appointed over the nations, because Jesus, even in his own defense, stated that if they're going to accuse him of blasphemy for calling himself Theos, a God, how can they do that when he even calls those against whom the word of God came gods in Psalm 82:6, John 10:33 through 36. So again, the sons of God are gods in that sense. He's not talking about them here. He's talking over and over about idols here.